the way that y'all treated Tracy so bad. And I asked this question and I said, please give me an example of how I treated Tracy bad. Give me an example of how I treated Tracy bad. Because I can't speak on behalf of anybody else other than me. So that was my question. And when I asked that question,
Towanda didn't tiptoe into that live. She walked in like someone who had finally decided she was done carrying the weight of other people's versions of her life. And the second she settled in under that bright phone light, the comment box started racing like a drumline. What began as a casual check-in with supporters, some laughs with her husband off camera, a little small talk about everyday things, shifted into a confession that felt less like celebrity gossip and more like a courtroom oath. Her tone was soft, but the edges were steel. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her jaw didn't wobble. And when she said the names Tracy, Toni, and Tamar, the air in the room, on both sides of that screen, changed color. People who had tuned in to hear jokes found themselves sitting up straighter, because this didn't feel like a scene, it felt like a reckoning. For years, fans had taken clips like communion, passing them around, arguing over them, cutting them into threads and timelines as if the edit were a holy text. Tracy storming out, Tamar exploding, Toni exhaling like she was above the chaos, Towanda sitting at the center with a face people swore meant one thing when it meant another. And now Towanda leaned toward the lens and asked a question that sounded simple but weighed 1,000 pounds. Give me one example. The way she said it, calm, unblinking, absolutely certain, was a dare and a plea at the same time. A dare to those who had built entire myths out of jump cuts and music cues. A plea to separate a sister from a storyline. Show me the receipts where I personally treated Tracy bad, she said. And suddenly the comment feed, always loud and messy, found itself quieter than usual. Because the truth was inconvenient, people had feelings, not facts. People remembered the heat of a moment, the sting of a look, the pain of a silence, but they didn't remember a single scene that proved Towanda was the villain they'd decided she was. And that, right there, was the crack that let the light in. Because when you ask people to point to the wound instead of describing the scar, the story shifts. Her voice didn't climb. It didn't need to. It cut through the internet's fog like a clean instrument. This is my name. This is my sister. This is what you think you know. This is what you can prove. Then she pulled back the curtain people pretend isn't there. The one held up by producers and editors and executives who smile warmly while they move scenes around like furniture. Editing, 2 syllables, a whole machine. Towanda didn't lash out at a person. She described a process. She reminded everyone how hours of life get squeezed into minutes. Then stretched back out with loops and callbacks until a sigh from Tuesday becomes a reaction to a fight on Friday. And a question asked 3 times becomes a question you think you heard 100. She chose a memory that fans carry like a meme, Toni asking, where the prom at? Over and over, in the finished episode. Funny, sure. Iconic, absolutely. But was it real? Not like that. According to Towanda, the line wasn't an obsessive loop. It was a handful of moments that got stitched into a rhythm because rhythm plays better on TV than nuance does. That's how a person becomes a bit and a family becomes a brand. People laughed for years, reposted the clip, teased the sisters at concerts, stitched the audio into cosplay and commentary. And right then, with the smallest tilt of truth, Towanda turned that laughter into a question mark. If that was edited for effect, what else was shaped to sell? How many raised voices were really one raised voice replayed from 3 angles? How many tears belonged together, and how many were borrowed from a different day because the score needed a crescendo? The realization doesn't simply ruin a joke. It rearranges memory. Once you see the tape spooling behind the curtain, it becomes impossible to unhear the hum of the machine, but the thing that made the room go still wasn't just the technical talk, it was the sentence that redefined the stakes: we're not a cast. We're a family. On other shows, people fight, block each other, and go home to separate lives. Here, holidays get tense because last week's argument is tonight's dinner. Group chats explode at 2 a.m. because a scene cut in half on television is a wound left wide open in real life. Fans say they'll be fine by next episode, not understanding that there is no next episode inside a house where sisters share parents, stories, grief, and history. Towanda set that boundary and then sharpened it with a warning built from equal parts love and iron. I can say something crazy about my sisters, but you better not. Some people heard arrogance. Others heard blood talking. Either way, everyone heard a line being drawn where there hadn't been one publicly before. It wasn't permission to be cruel. It was a reminder that the audience had turned private pain into comment section sport, and the scoreboard didn't reset when the credits rolled. Behind the memes were women who still had to pick up phones, look at old photos, answer texts from cousins, sit with silence after funerals. Behind everything was Tracy, not the storyline, the person. Towanda never weaponized her name. She protected it even as she defended her own. She said the world had watched fragments and then built a universe out of shards, and her voice dipped, not to manipulate, but because love sounds different when it's carrying a ghost. There was a life before the cameras, she said, almost to herself, and you could feel 1,000 hot takes pause to breathe. Of course, the internet doesn't sit in stillness for long. While she was still live, people were opening old episodes, pointing at looks and pauses like they were fingerprints. Some claimed Tamar's blow-ups were captured as they happened. Others said she was edited into the lightning rod because every story needs a storm. Towanda refused to turn her sister into a scapegoat or a shield. She didn't say fake. She said shaped. She described time being bent, context being shaved, reactions being moved like puzzle pieces to fit a picture the audience would buy on Monday night. And then there was Toni, the name that drops differently because it carries Grammys and gravity. Towanda didn't diminish her. She humanized her. The composed big sister had her own untelevised heat and hurt. She said, but the show preferred a certain shine. So some of those edges got sanded down until Toni looked like the cathedral while everyone else played the stained glass. Fans who loved the pedestal felt defensive. Fans who wanted fairness felt vindicated. But both groups were hearing the same subtext: any edit that exaggerates one person must, by design, minimize another. You cannot enlarge a single frame without shrinking someone at the border. Then the money question landed like a brick wrapped in velvet. Why didn't they get paid like the Kardashians? It's the comparison that crawls out whenever black women give the world their unvarnished selves and the world rewards them with headlines instead of empires. Towanda answered with restraint, numbers aren't public, people don't know what they think they know, but the point had already pierced the conversation. People weren't really asking about contracts. They were asking about value. Two families gave the culture drama, humor, spectacle, hustle. One turned it into a global dynasty while the other traded pieces of their real history for seasons and spin-offs and a constant fight to control the narrative of their own names. Was it race? Was it network calculus? Was it the cost of being honest in a market that prefers performance to truth? Towanda didn't sharpen those words. She didn't need to. She sat down enough to let the audience carry the rest to the timeline. And they did, instantly. Threads bloomed with media critiques. Clips of her saying, "We're a family," flooded reels. Some people saluted her courage. Some called it revision. The internet loves certainty more than honesty because certainty trends better. But honesty has a different kind of staying power. It haunts. The most disarming part was how Towanda refused to let the moment be only fire. She joked with her husband in the middle of the heat, fiddled with a light detail, smiled at an inside joke about music. It didn't erase the tension. It proved the point. Life doesn't split itself into episodes with perfect act breaks. You can be cutting through a years-long narrative with surgical precision and still laugh about moisturizer because someone off camera made a face. That's what family looks like. Messy, layered, out of order. And that may be the truest argument against the myth her critics cling to. None of this fits in a neat caption. When she circled back to Traci, her voice carried the mercy people rarely afford reality stars. She didn't deny the pain people saw. She argued with the certainty that viewers attached to it. Pain is real, she implied. Edits are, too. Both can exist, and neither gives anyone the right to turn a woman's memory into a cudgel to hit her sisters with forever. The comments turned into a tiny war, accusations of gaslighting on one side, gratitude on the other. But Towanda kept the same measured tone, as if she had rehearsed this argument with herself enough times to know there was no way to win it. Only a way to speak it cleanly. By then, gossip accounts were already chopping the live into digestible bites. And the machine she'd exposed got to work in real time. Headlines that praised her clarity sat beside headlines that accused her of rewriting history. People scanned Tamar's likes for shade, waited for Toni's statement like it was a royal decree. And over everything hovered a question that won't leave this family alone. If Traci were here, what would she say? Would she nod and say the producers amplified her worst days? Or would she fold her arms and tell her sisters that the hurt they didn't see on set was the same hurt fans felt at home? No one can answer, and that's why the debate never ends. Silence is its own editor, crueler, sometimes, than the one in post-production. When the live ended, it didn't really end. It expanded. Fans became producers, splicing Towanda's sentences into the stories they already wanted to tell. And maybe that's the final, bitter symmetry. She tried to name the manipulation, and the internet did what the internet does. It turned a full-bodied conversation into loops and hooks. Even so, for anyone listening past the noise, something essential landed. Towanda didn't come to bury her sisters or baptize herself as spotless. She came to say, you watched pieces. We lived holes. You saw a beat. We heard the score. We are not characters. We are a family. And whether the world claps or drags, that truth remains. Heavy as love and sharp as a cut that's still healing. What happened after the live is what always happens when truth, messy, Human, inconvenient truth, escapes the frame and meets an audience that prefers certainty. The story stopped belonging to Towanda and started belonging to everyone with a Wi-Fi signal and an opinion. Gossip pages clipped her calm challenge into 12-second loops, podcasts announced emergency episodes. And fans who had sworn they were done with the discourse were suddenly writing paragraphs like they were drafting closing arguments. But there was a quieter current moving underneath the noise, a reckoning that only families feel when the world starts rearranging their memories for them. Towanda sat with that weight and did what people rarely do after they go viral. She didn't double down for applause or apologize for optics. She clarified for conscience. She reminded anyone listening that being 36 at the start meant she wasn't birthed by a pilot episode. She had already lived through childhood roles, middle child translations, the slow arithmetic of who carries what in a house full of dreamers and grief. Before the cameras, Toni had already been the world siren, the one whose voice could stop a room. Tamar had already learned how to turn volume into armor and humor into a shield. Traci had already been negotiating love and longing with the stubborn dignity of someone who refuses to be erased. And Towanda, often mislabeled as neutral or cold, had already been the sister who learned to read a room and keep the roof from collapsing. When television arrived, it didn't invent those identities. It monetized them. And once something is monetized, it starts steering itself. That's why a sigh becomes a symbol and a look becomes a verdict. That's why a private pause becomes public proof. Towanda said as much without preaching, explaining how shots get stacked. How reaction cutaways are sometimes pulled from an entirely different day. How music tells you when to be suspicious, when to laugh, when to cry. It isn't a conspiracy. It's craft, and craft becomes corrosive when it pretends to be a mirror instead of a mosaic. People kept asking about Tamar, because they wanted a villain or a victim and didn't know what to do with a sister who has been both, sometimes in the same hour. Towanda refused the bait. She didn't sanitize the blow-ups, but she refused to let the blow-ups be the whole story. She described context like a nurse describing anatomy. This goes here, that connects there, and if you cut this vein on purpose, you'll call the blood a plot twist. Then the conversation curved back to Toni, the pedestal, and the person. Towanda acknowledged the polish without resenting it, saying out loud what most families whisper. Sometimes protecting one sister's image becomes a quiet tax on another sister's honesty. The edit keeps one crown gleaming, and the cost is paid in unseen scenes where everyone else is framed a little sharper, a little louder, a little less forgivable. Not because Toni asked for it, but because television loves a cathedral and doesn't know what to do with an entire city of women who are all sacred in different ways. When she spoke of Traci, her cadence slowed, and you could feel the internet lean in despite itself. She painted memories that never aired, inside jokes that ran for years. Food that tasted like peace after arguments. Late-night calls where sisters reminded each other they were more than the worst moment the world had witnessed. She didn't contest the ache fans saw. She contested the ownership of it. Traci's life, she said gently, is not a receipt book for outsiders to cash in whenever they want to wound the living. And because the internet has a reflex for scoreboard questions, the money topic returned, heavier now that people were comparing brands like legacies could be tallied in SKUs. Towanda didn't fling numbers. She named dynamics, the difference between spectacle and soul, the calculus of who gets crowned for chaos and who gets consumed by it. Was it race alone? She didn't flatten it like that. She suggested something more layered, systems built to reward certain kinds of mess and penalize other kinds of truth. Rooms where notes are given with smiles that sound like compliments but function like leashes. Deals that look fair on page 1 and feel like handcuffs by season 3. Meanwhile, producers, silent in public, buzzing in private, were already thinking in beats. If Towanda's line, "We're not a cast. We're a family," moved this much conversation off-season, what might it do on camera? That irony wasn't lost on Towanda. She laughed, lightly, about skincare again, about a song stuck in her head, not to deflect but to demonstrate the point. Real life is ridiculous that way. It sets a boundary and then remembers it needs to marinate chicken for dinner. In DMs, church friends checked on her. In group chats, cousins sent heart emojis and old photos. In comment threads, strangers demanded proof while standing on edits they had mistaken for evidence. And somewhere between all that noise and all that love, Towanda made a private decision the public will only recognize later. She would stop arguing with the internet's desire to be right and start tending to the family's need to be whole. That meant reaching out, even when pride said wait. That meant listening, even when memory said defend. That meant calling Tamar with no agenda but breath, texting Toni with no performance but care, speaking Traci's name softly without turning her into punctuation for a post. Because a brand can survive on narrative, but a family only survives on nourishment. And if the world insists on turning their surname into content, then at least inside the house someone must insist on turning the content back into care. The paradox is brutal. Towanda's attempt to slow the machine fed it for a week, but the seed she planted was quieter and stronger. She taught anyone truly listening how to spot a splice, how to hear the hum under the headline, how to refuse the cheap high of outrage in favor of the harder work of context. And as the timelines kept spinning, she did the untelegenic thing. She closed the app, opened her messages, and began stitching what cameras can't capture: small apologies that no one screenshotted, private gratitude that no one clipped, and boundaries that don't trend because they're built slowly. Like trust, like truth, like a legacy that intends to outlive the noise. By the time the storm fully settled into the bloodstream of the internet, the Braxton name was no longer simply trending. It was being rewritten in real time by strangers with keyboards who believed they owned the right to interpret a family's scars. And it was in this thick, suffocating atmosphere that Towanda realized the live wasn't just a defense. It was an origin point for a new cycle of spectacle that she could no longer control. She had gone live to carve out space for herself, to show that behind every accusation there was context. Behind every clip there was an edit, behind every meme there was a human heartbeat. But the world took her honesty and spun it into fresh gossip, slicing her words into fragments that fit whatever narrative each blog or podcast needed to survive. And as hashtags multiplied, the weight of silence pressed harder on Toni, who had long built her brand on a balance of regal composure and careful distance. The longer she remained quiet, the louder people speculated, painting her as either the saint the producers wanted her to be or the architect of a silence that let her sisters take the blows. Tamar, meanwhile, was fire in waiting. She had never been one to let a narrative grow without her voice in it, and already whispers spread that she was preparing her own rebuttal, her own live, her own reclamation. Fans were split. Some begged her to confirm Towanda's claim that editing had exaggerated her image, others urged her to clap back and accuse her sister of shifting blame. The suspense was intoxicating because people weren't just watching for answers, they were watching for a continuation of the same family drama they claimed to hate. The cruel truth was that grief itself had become entertainment. And Traci's memory, the sister whose absence still hollowed every room, was dragged again and again through timelines like a prop no one wanted to admit they were using. Towanda knew it, she felt it, she could hear the ache in her own words when she spoke of her sister with tenderness that couldn't be reduced to a storyline. She had begged the audience to separate receipts from reality, edits from lived history. But the fandom had no interest in nuance. They wanted sides, villains, victims. They wanted a courtroom verdict in the theater of public opinion. That's why even as she repeated, "We're not a cast, we're a family," people clipped it into slogans, sold it as merch, and reshaped it into content that pulled likes off her pain. And yet, beneath the chaos, something vital was happening that couldn't be measured in reposts. Inside her own walls, Towanda had opened conversations that had been frozen for years. She reached out to Toni, not with the stiffness of someone protecting a brand but with the softness of someone reminding a sister that love outlives edits. She called Tamar, and even when the call was loud, emotional, messy, it was also real. Two sisters choosing to engage directly instead of letting strangers narrate their relationship. She invoked Traci's name in whispers at night, not as a shield but as a prayer, remembering the moments the world never saw, the private laughter, the reconciliation after fights, the shared meals that healed wounds producers would have killed to capture. And in those moments, she found a kind of strength no trending topic could provide, a reminder that family can survive being commodified if the people inside it choose to keep doing the hard work of love. Still, the questions lingered, questions that may never have answers. Was Towanda truly exposing truth, or was she carving her own absolution? Was she defending Traci's legacy or reframing it through her own lens? Was she protecting her sisters or protecting herself? The silence that followed those questions became louder than the words themselves, because silence, once broken, becomes something else entirely. It becomes memory, echo, myth. And as fans dissected every sentence, comparing the Braxtons again to the Kardashians, debating race, respect, and the brutal economics of reality TV, Towanda carried on in the only way she knew how, by insisting that beyond edits, beyond narratives, beyond public debates, they were still just sisters, still just daughters, still just women trying to stitch together dignity from the fragments left behind. That is the paradox of their story. They had given the world a decade of authenticity turned into spectacle, and in return the world demanded more spectacle in the name of authenticity. Towanda's life was never just about defending herself, it was about holding up a mirror to a culture that consumes black women's pain as primetime entertainment and then discards them without crowns, without empires, without the respect they deserve. And while she could not answer for the entire industry, she could answer for herself. She had drawn the line, she had said the words. She had reminded the world that behind every meme there is blood, behind every storyline there is grief. Behind every Braxton there is a family still trying to love each other in a world that profits more from their fractures than their unity. And that, more than any edit, any contract, or any trending hashtag, will remain the most unforgettable truth of all.